The dawn in Greystone, Illinois, seemed peaceful, giving no hint of the horror about to unfold. But when 14-year-old Mark woke to screams echoing through the Warren home, he didn't immediately understand what was happening. Barefoot, he crept downstairs, his steps hesitant against the cold floor. The house was unnaturally silent, broken only by the rustling of trees outside. In the kitchen, Mark froze at a sight that would haunt him forever. Lying in a pool of blood was his adoptive mother, Sarah. Her lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, her hands bound tightly behind her back. Deep gashes along her neck revealed the brutal way her life was taken. Her fingers were scratched and raw, as if she had desperately tried to untie herself or fight back. Nearby lay James, her husband, face down on the blood-stained floor. His back bore numerous knife wounds, cutting through his shirt and flesh to the bone. Blood had pooled around him, dark and sticky on the worn wooden floorboards. His outstretched hand reached toward the kitchen table, as if in a final effort to grab something. Mark stood paralyzed, unable to scream. His gaze locked onto a bloodied kitchen knife on the floor, its blade so drenched in crimson that droplets still dripped with an eerie plop, plop. Turning toward the living room, Mark's horror deepened. The room was a scene of chaos. Curtains ripped down, the television shattered, and a massive blood smear on the wall that appeared to have been made by the killer's hands. At the center of the disarray lay a torn piece of clothing, a t-shirt that unmistakably belonged to his older brother, Andy. With trembling hands, Mark dialed 911. His voice was broken and shaky as he explained what he had found. Police arrived swiftly, the scene shocking even seasoned detectives. "There's no sign of forced entry," one officer muttered, inspecting the door. "This was someone with a key." "Over here," another called, pointing to the wall. Scrawled in blood were the chilling words, "You brought this on yourselves." Andy, the older of the two adoptive sons, became the prime suspect almost immediately. His troubled past painted a damning picture. Prior arrests for fighting, a history of anger management issues, and a stint in a psychiatric facility. To make matters worse, Andy had disappeared the same night the murders took place. "Looks like he snapped," the sergeant remarked. This wasn't some random burglary. The local media pounced on the story. Headlines blared accusations. Unstable teen murders adoptive parents? Mark was the only one who refused to believe his brother was guilty. "Andy couldn't have done this," he insisted to the police. "He had his problems, but he loved us. He protected me when kids bullied me at school. He always stood up for us." But Mark's account conflicted with the mounting evidence. Andy's disappearance, combined with his history, made him an easy target. The police issued a warrant for Andy's arrest, and Detective Thomas Gray began unraveling the grim truth behind the night's events. The police continued their search of the Warren house, but the real tension began when investigators came across a locked door leading to the basement. The door was massive, with thick metal hinges and an old but sturdy lock. Detective Thomas Gray, seasoned but visibly weary, nodded to a patrol officer who had brought a crowbar. The lock gave way after a few minutes, but the door itself resisted, creaking and jamming as though it hadn't been opened in years. When it finally gave way with a sharp crack, a heavy, suffocating smell greeted them. The basement was dark and damp, its walls stained with mold and cobwebs. Flashlight beams revealed a narrow hallway that led to several rooms deeper within. No one spoke. Even the youngest investigators hesitated to break the oppressive silence. Every step echoed loudly in the stillness. Gray was the first to enter a large room that appeared to have once been a storage area. Amid old boxes, rusted tools, and broken furniture, something immediately caught their attention. On a dusty table lay yellow documents, notebooks, and a collection of tapes. They were carefully arranged, as if someone had been sorting through them but abandoned the task abruptly. Gray picked up one of the notebooks and began to read. It was Sarah Warren's journal, detailing Andy's behavior in chilling detail. March 2nd, he hit Mark again over a toy. "James says it's normal, but I'm scared. He's changing." June 15th, Andy woke up in the middle of the night, He was sitting in the corner of his room, whispering. When I asked what was wrong, he said, "It's not me. They make me do it." July 30th. James says we made a mistake, but it's too late now. He hates us. I can see it in his eyes. We've lost control. The entries were horrifying, but what truly shook the team was what a patrolman found in an old metal box in the corner. Inside were several Polaroid photos. They showed Andy, but not in ordinary circumstances. One photo depicted him at school, standing by a bench with a knife in his hand. Another showed him in his room, painting something on the wall. But the most disturbing were a series of photos seemingly taken in the basement. In one, Andy sat on the floor, covered in blood, with the phrase, "You can't stop this," scrawled in large red letters on the wall behind him. An even more chilling discovery was an audio recording found on an old tape recorder. When they played it, Sarah's voice, filled with fear and despair, filled the room. It wasn't him. He doesn't understand what he's doing. But that's no excuse. We shouldn't have done this. We knew it was wrong. But they convinced us. Now we're just waiting for it to end. I'm sorry, Mark. Gray turned off the tape without a word. His expression was grim, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. As he scanned the room, his eyes fell on a drawer that looked heavier than the rest of the furniture. Inside, they found another set of documents, this time financial records. They detailed payments that James and Sarah had been receiving from a private organization, whose name had been carefully redacted on most of the papers. Suddenly, screams echoed from the hallway. One of the investigators had opened another room, and in the far corner, they found something that froze everyone in place. It was an old mannequin, painted to resemble bloodied flesh, with crudely drawn eyes and a twisted, grinning mouth. A sign hung around its neck, reading, "Want the truth? Pay the price." Outside, Mark, who had been sitting in a patrol car the entire time, began screaming uncontrollably. "He's coming back. You don't understand. It wasn't him. They made him do it." The boy was so hysterical that paramedics were called to sedate him. But was it the rambling of a terrified child, or something more sinister? Gray couldn't shake the feeling that Mark knew more than he was letting on, and that this case would haunt him as one of the most horrifying of his career. After uncovering the hidden safe in the basement filled with unsettling journals, audio recordings, and documents that exposed the dark sides of Andy's adoptive parents, Detective Gray felt the case spiraling in an unexpected direction. Instead of solidifying suspicions against the boy, the evidence cast doubt on everything they thought they knew. Who was the real victim in this family? Gray couldn't shake the feeling that someone in this case was working to cover their tracks. But who? His partner, Sergeant Carter, tried to keep the investigation focused. "We need to concentrate on finding Andy," Carter said as he reviewed the latest leads on the boy's whereabouts. "He's the key to all of this. Find him and we'll get our answers." Meanwhile, a psychologist working with Mark began to extract new details. It became increasingly clear that James and Sarah weren't the picture-perfect parents they seemed to be. Their home, while appearing cozy and welcoming to neighbors, harbored dark secrets that might explain the violence of their deaths. None of these revelations made Gray's job easier. They only deepened the mystery. The next morning, as he combed through the basement materials again, a patrol officer reported a breakthrough. Someone matching Andy's description had been found hiding in an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town. Gray rushed to the location immediately. Andy was huddled in the corner of the shed, his arms wrapped tightly around his head. He looked exhausted, his face scratched and his clothes filthy. His voice, barely more than a whisper, trembled as he said, "I didn't do it. You have to believe me." Gray studied the boy carefully. His eyes brimmed with fear, his body rigid like a cornered animal. "Andy, I need to know what happened that night," Gray said, his tone gentle but firm. "Everything you saw or heard." Andy looked up at Gray with a vacant expression. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I saw him, the man in black. He was leaving the house that night. I couldn't stay. I knew they'd blame me." Gray noticed Andy's fists clenched tightly and took a small step closer, trying to draw more from him. "A man? Tell me more." What did he look like? What was he doing? Andy began to recount his memories, his voice shaky and uneven as if revisiting something deeply painful. I woke up to screaming. When I looked into the hallway, he was already gone. But I saw him going down the stairs. He was holding something in his hand, something shiny. Then he just disappeared. Though Andy's words sounded naive, they planted a seed of doubt in Gray's mind. The boy appeared genuinely terrified. But did that mean he was telling the truth? Or was he crafting a story to escape the consequences? After taking Andy to the station, Gray realized the case had become even more tangled. Not only did he need to uncover the truth, but he also had to unravel the motives driving every person in this chilling tale. Detective Thomas Gray heard the whisper like a shadow creeping into the room, carrying a weight of dread that settled deep in his chest. Sitting in his cramped office under the cold glow of the desk lamp, he reflected on the recent revelations. Mark's troubling confession about his parents' harsh punishments gnawed at him, intertwining with the mounting evidence that painted an increasingly sinister picture. Every step of the investigation felt like descending further into a darkness that had no end. Stepping outside, the biting wind cut across Gray's face, a chilling reminder that he was inching closer to something far more terrifying than he had anticipated. The clues hinted at layers of deception, but none yet explained the brutality of the murders, which grew more calculated and merciless with every revelation. Back in his office, Gray sifted through the reports again, trying to piece together the fragments. Hours turned into an endless blur as each new detail raised more questions than it answered. Then something caught his eye, a peculiar thread buried in the financial records of the Warren family. Small, unexplained transactions sent to obscure locations on dates that coincided with moments of significant pressure on James and Sarah Warren. Gray's pulse quickened. These transactions suggested something far beyond financial mismanagement. They hinted at connections to a darker web of secrets. Every new piece of information deepened his suspicion. This family was far from the wholesome image they presented. Mark's earlier mention of arguments between James and a stranger in their yard replayed in Gray's mind. He had tried to find witnesses, but their silence only added to the mystery. Normally, such reticence wouldn't alarm him, but now it felt like part of a larger puzzle that refused to fit together. Gray revisited Mark's testimony, his voice echoing in Gray's thoughts. I heard screams, not just from my father. It wasn't just anger. It was something worse, something I'd never heard before. And I saw my father holding something in his hand. I couldn't tell what it was, but he looked different. A chill crept up Gray's spine. This wasn't just a family quarrel. It was something far more sinister. Piece by piece, the narrative shifted. James Warren wasn't merely a victim of circumstances. He was entangled in something far bigger and darker. And the deeper Gray delved, the more he felt this case would uncover dangerous truths some were desperate to keep buried. Meanwhile, at the psychiatric facility where Andy was under observation, the boy continued to withhold details, his fear palpable. Gray could sense that Andy knew more than he let on, but the boy seemed to hide behind accusations of madness, using them as a shield. But I know more, things that shouldn't be said, Andy whispered when Gray confronted him again. For a moment, Gray froze, the air around them feeling heavy and suffocating. He was certain the missing piece was locked inside this frightened boy's mind. Looking Andy in the eyes, he spoke firmly but gently. You loved them, didn't you? If you don't tell us everything, we can't bring them justice. The killer will walk free, laughing at how he got away with it. Andy's head drooped, and he let out a trembling breath before he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. That night, I saw everything. A man in black broke into the house. He held a knife to Mom's throat, forcing Dad to sign some papers. They were screaming. I'll never forget their screams. And then the slaughter started. I was so scared. I hid in my room and couldn't move, even when it all went quiet. I just sat there, praying he wouldn't find me. His words trailed off, and his body trembled as the harrowing memories consumed him. For Gray, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. But as the picture became clearer, so did the danger. This wasn't just about justice for a family. It was a battle against forces willing to do anything to keep their secrets hidden. The investigation, which had been ongoing for months, was taking a dangerous turn. Detective Thomas Gray could feel himself inching closer to the truth, but each revelation seemed more like a nightmare. The last few days were a haze. His mind struggled to process the tangled web of evidence and testimonies, which only seemed to lead to further confusion. That all changed when he stumbled upon a critical piece of evidence. In his office, reviewing hours of surveillance footage, Gray found an archive from the night of the murder. The grainy video revealed an unknown man dressed in black moving quietly through the Warrens' backyard. The footage fast-forwarded through an hour, and then the same man re-emerged, carrying a large bag gripped as though it was his most prized possession. The camera failed to capture the bag's contents, but one thing was clear. This man wasn't a random visitor. The face was obscured, but Gray found what he needed. Digging deeper, Gray identified the man as Roger Bennett, James Warren's former business partner, a man with motive for revenge. Bennett had allegedly threatened Warren over unpaid debts, and their last conversation, recorded before the murder, left little doubt about his anger. Gray was certain Bennett was the key to unraveling everything. But by the time the police tried to track him down, Bennett had vanished. The trail led to an abandoned warehouse just miles outside the city. Acting on a tip from an informant, Gray organized a raid. This was their last chance to catch Bennett, and Gray knew failure wasn't an option. At dawn, as the first light crept across the horizon, Gray and his team approached the warehouse. They moved quietly, knowing surprise was their only advantage. Adrenaline coursed through Gray's veins as he signaled his team to take positions. This was it, the endgame of a dark and twisted tale. As they closed in, the tension snapped. Bennett had been expecting them. Gray gave the signal and the team breached the warehouse. Chaos erupted. In the dim light, sliced only by their flashlights, they found Bennett kneeling in the center of the room. Blood covered his clothes, his face marred by cuts and bruises. It was as though he'd been waiting to be caught, but the situation spiraled fast. Bennett leapt to his feet and grabbed one of the officers, pulling him close. "Let me go or he dies," Bennett growled, his voice void of fear but heavy with desperation. The wild look in his eyes sent a chill through Gray. This was not a man who could be reasoned with. Negotiations began, but Bennett wasn't listening. His trembling hands revealed his rage. And then, the moment everyone feared came to life. Bennett drew a knife from behind the hostage and plunged it into his chest. Blood spurted, painting the floor in crimson as the officer crumpled to the ground, eyes wide in frozen shock. Everything froze for a beat, then shots rang out. SWAT officers, unable to wait any longer, opened fire. 3 bullets struck Bennett, dropping him instantly. His body convulsed briefly before going still. The silence that followed was deafening. Gray stared at the fallen Bennett, the lifeless body of the officer still bleeding onto the cold floor. Victory tasted hollow. Bennett was dead, but the questions weren't. How did this connect to the Warren secrets? Why had they become the target of such a nightmare? As Gray stood over Bennett's lifeless body, he realized the case was far from over. Though the man responsible was gone, the darkness he left behind remained, and the horrors of this case would haunt Gray long after the investigation was closed. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. What moment in this story impacted you the most? Do you think this was a true victory for Detective Gray? And remember, sometimes the truth hides where you least expect it,